Hey friends, welcome to Twisted Roots, a corner of the internet where we tell true-to-heart stories about family, the messy, the tender, the hard one. If you believe a good story can change the way a day feels, you're in the right place. If this one stays with you, tap subscribe and let the next story find you when you need it. Title: I worked 2 jobs to pay for my son's sports career, then he called me useless. Stadium lights have a way of making everything look cleaner than it is. They bleach the corners, hide the grease under your nails, turn last night's coffee into steam on a cold breath. I stood on the top row of the bleachers with a paper cup in my hand and a day's worth of sweat in my shirt, the kind of ache you don't brag about because it's just living. Down on the field, my boy moved like he'd been promised the end zone. Ethan, number 11, shoulders back, chin up. The way coaches teach you when they want the world to notice. The band was working through the same 3 songs. The Booster Club moms were stirring hot chocolate and opinions. The dads in crisp polos were swapping phrases like combine and scholarship as if they were discussing weather patterns they knew how to control. I stood where I always stand, top rail, left side, near the light pole that hums. There's a trick to watching from up high. You can see the whole play. You also hear the words that don't belong to you. I'm used to both. By day I load trucks, by night I scrub floors. The joke I tell in my head is that I get to see America from both ends, what goes out and what gets left behind. It paid for cleats when his feet grew like lies. It paid for camps with names that sounded like doors. I learned the difference between witty outs and slot receivers the way some men learn wine. I learned how to stretch a paycheck until it squeaked. I learned tired has more than one shade. Third quarter, the game broke open. Ethan ran a slant, caught the ball at the hip, and turned upfield with a grace that doesn't come from coaching. It comes from the long corridor between wanting and work. He blew past one defender, slipped another, dove for the pylon. The crowd rose like bread. I don't cheer loud anymore. I let the noise wash through me. And I save my voice for when it matters. The scoreboard clicked like a clock changing its mind. 27-14. His teammates mobbed him in the end zone, jerseys slapping, helmets knocking. Somewhere below me, a little kid with a foam finger shouted my son's name as if he'd invented it. I smiled the small smile a father earns by standing very still. When it was over, handshakes, chin straps loose, plastic cups rattling in trash cans, I took the long way down the bleachers, careful on the slick steps. I don't move fast after a double shift. The field smelled like cut grass and new bragging. The team clustered near the fence where the families wait, flash bulbs. Phones held high. The light on my phone cracked months ago. It shines a little crooked. I don't take pictures, I remember. Ethan, I called not loud, just enough so he'd know where to look. He turned. For a second, 1 heartbeat and a half. He wore the face he had at 8, the one that used to press against my jacket after late practices, sweat cooling into sleep. Then he saw me fully. The jacket I've worn too many winters, the boots with their permanent scuff. The paper cup that says I wasn't born in a suite. A couple of his teammates glanced from him to me, then back to him. The kind of glance boys learn from men who care too much about the wrong scoreboard. Hey champ, I said, proud of you. The space between us wasn't much, 10 steps, maybe 11, but I've worked jobs where 10 steps is the difference between shipping and the floor. You would be surprised how far it can feel. He didn't take the steps. We're headed to Route 6, one of the boys said to him, meaning burgers and loudness and a line of cars that hums the same song. You in? Another boy laughed too big, the way kids laugh when they want the world to believe they're not unsure. Ethan ran his tongue across his teeth, the habit he's had since he was 3 and trying to bite back tears. He straightened his shoulders more. Dad, he said, and I heard the warning in the word before the rest of it came. Don't make a thing of it. I won't, I said. Just wanted to say you played smart, that turn on the slant. Stop, he cut in, eyes flicking to the boys, then to me like I was a test he didn't study for. You don't have to keep showing up. It's weird. A mother nearby, polished and well-meaning, said to nobody in particular, these nights go by so fast, and for me they slowed to a drip. Showing up is what I do, I said, softer than I felt. There are sentences you practice your whole life without knowing, and there are sentences that write you. He rolled his eyes, how fast a roll can slice, and the boys snickered. Someone muttered, construction dad, as if it were a species. That one stung less than you'd think. I've been called worse by people I loved more. Then he did it, the thing the title of a life hangs on. He took a breath he wanted everyone to see and said, "You're useless, Dad. You don't get it. Just stop, please. Useless. It's a small word, 4 letters that would look harmless cut from a cereal box. But in the mouth of your own child, it finds a place to live you didn't know you had. Folks talk about words as weapons. What they forget is how quiet a blade can be. I didn't say anything for a moment. It wasn't because I had nothing. It was because I had too much. I thought of the night he had the fever that scared the dog. Of the morning I sold my fishing rods for camp tuition. Of the way he slept in the back seat after tournaments. Sock lines carving the map of a growing boy into his calves. I thought of the pink blister on my palm that never closes, the one my body built to remember. A coach I like, one of the good ones, caught my eye across the chain link. He wore a face people reserve for funerals and hospital hallways. He started to come closer and then thought better of it. Some moments don't want witnesses. Behind me, the light pole hummed. It always does. I stared at the little rectangle of tape on my jacket that holds the zipper tab on. You teach yourself not to look at your child when they're trying to be cruel because it's a hunger you don't feed. "Okay," I said. The word surprised me by standing up straight. "Okay, son." I set the paper cup down on the concrete lip of the bleacher and nodded as if he'd asked me directions instead of a boundary. I took the stairs again, slow. Because I am not a man who runs unless there is a fire, and even then I check for children first. At the gate, the ticket taker, a woman with a purple scarf and a voice like morning, said, "Good game," out of habit. I told her it was. In the parking lot, the wind found the damp at my collar and made a home there. A father in a clean truck honked twice for his star, and the horn made the air pretend to laugh. I unlocked my sedan by feel. The key sticks the way old promises do. Here's a thing about working 2 jobs. You get good at driving by muscle memory. Your hands learn the wheel. Your eyes know where the deer like to cross. Your heart knows the roads it can take without stopping. I sat there and let the engine idle until the radio remembered the station. A preacher talked about forgiveness and a weatherman promised rain. Both sounded certain. I looked in the rearview at a man who once swore he'd carry his son to any finish line that would have him. The mirror is unkind and neon, but it tells the truth if you can take it. There was a line of dirt across my cheek I hadn't felt, and the shadow of a sleep I was too busy to earn. Useless. I said the word out loud once, the way you test a bridge with your foot. It held. Then I said another word, one I hadn't used in a long time. Enough. I turned the key. The dash flickered. Somewhere behind me a cheer went up from the Route 6 parking lot. Boys conquering fries. The lights on the field dimmed in sections like a giant drawing its breath. I pulled onto the road that leads to my night job, and like a man carrying something heavy the right way, I let the weight settle where it belonged. The thing about words is that they don't always die when they are spoken. Some crawl into your coat pocket and ride home with you. Some wake up with you the next morning, staring from the ceiling before the alarm does. Useless was like that. It hummed under my skin all night as I scrubbed office floors, polishing the shine-off shoes I'd never afford. By dawn, I was carrying it the way a man carries a stone in his chest. No one else sees it, but it pulls at every step. The weekend came with another game, bigger this time. Scouts in the stands, men with clipboards and college logos on their jackets. The bleachers were packed, mothers in bright scarves. Fathers leaning against the rail with sunglasses they didn't need. The kind of night where everyone rehearses how they want to be seen. I wore the same jacket I always wear, the zipper tab still held by tape, the boots that know every inch of factory floor. I wasn't there for them. I was there for one boy in a jersey with the number 11 stitched across his back. When Ethan jogged onto the field, the crowd roared, phones tilted, recording his every stride. He didn't look toward the top bleacher this time. He didn't need to. He knew where I'd be. After the win, another brilliant touchdown, another roar that shook the metal benches. The team gathered near the fence where families pressed close. Reporters snapped pictures. Scouts whispered to each other. One even clapped Ethan on the shoulder as if the future were already signed in ink. I made my way down, slower than the rest, carrying pride in my chest even as the stone weighed heavy. When Ethan finally reached the fence, I raised a hand, the same way I used to wave from the porch when the bus dropped him home from school. "Son," I said, that was, but before the rest of the sentence could stumble out. One of his teammates cut in with a laugh that wasn't meant for me but pierced anyway. "Yo, Ethan, that your dad thought you said he worked the docks or something." Another boy smirked. Man looks like he came straight from the janitor's closet. They chuckled, not cruelly in their own minds, just the careless cruelty of teenagers who mistake someone else's sweat for comedy. Ethan could have stopped it. He could have said one word, placed one arm around my shoulder. And it would have ended there. Instead, he froze, glanced at me, then at them. His silence was worse than their laughter. Silence can be a kind of agreement. Then the line that burned deeper than the first insult. He just shows up, don't mind him, he doesn't get it. Just like that, don't mind him, as if I were not flesh and bone, but a mistake to be excused. A man made invisible by the son he broke his back to raise. The mothers nearby laughed politely, as if awkwardness could be swept away with a smile. A father clapped Ethan on the back and said, "Focus on the game, kid, you've got a future." Nobody looked at me. Nobody saw the way my hands curled into the fence, the chain link imprinting its pattern into my skin. I didn't argue, I didn't shout. There are battles you don't fight in public, not because you're weak, but because you know the crowd isn't listening. I let go of the fence, left the words hanging there with the smoke of grilled hot dogs and the roar of a victory that suddenly didn't taste like victory at all. On the walk back to the parking lot, I heard a mother whisper to another. Poor man, kids these days, but whispers don't stitch wounds, they only remind you you're blighting. At home, I placed my work boots by the door the way I always do. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook I hadn't opened in months. The pages smelled faintly of dust and resolve. I wrote one line, steady and slow. Respect cannot be begged, it must be remembered, and if it is forgotten, then maybe so must I. Then I closed the book, turned off the light, and let the darkness sit where applause used to be. Humiliation has a way of echoing. You can leave the field, shut the car door, close the house blinds, but the sound of your own child dismissing you doesn't fade with distance. It lingers like the ringing in your ears after standing too close to fireworks. That night it hummed in me so loud I couldn't sleep, so I did what men like me often do when the present feels unbearable. I wandered backward into memory. I remembered a boy who once thought I was larger than life. Ethan was maybe 5, still small enough to curl up on my lap without making my legs ache. It was summer. He ran barefoot through the yard, grass stains painting his ankles, his tiny fists clutched around wildflowers he'd yanked from the ground. "Here, Daddy," he'd said, holding them out like treasure. "These are for you, you're the best part of this house." And I believed him. God help me, I did. There was another night, darker and sharper. A storm cracked open the sky and his asthma flared like a sudden fire. I carried him through the rain, shoes slapping puddles, chest heaving harder than his own. At the ER, while machines breathed steady beeps, his small hand gripped my finger as though I was the rope pulling him back to life. I told him I wouldn't let go. I never did. When he turned 8, he wanted to play football. Not cartoons, not toys, just football. I saved for weeks, skipped meals. Worked overtime shifts until I could afford a pair of cleats that came in a cardboard box so bright it looked like Christmas morning. He opened them, gasped, then wrapped his arms around my neck. "You're my hero," he whispered, voice muffled into my shirt. I can still feel the warmth of it against my chest. Hero, useless, same man, same father, same hands, but two very different words from the same boy. Memory can be cruel like that. It shows you the gold of yesterday right when today feels like rust. I leaned back in my chair, the notebook still closed before me. My palms were rough, lines of work etched deeper than ink could go. I thought of how many lunches I skipped so he could have his protein shakes, how many nights I cleaned offices when I should have been home resting, how many times I told myself this is worth it because the boy who once gave me wildflowers might one day give me pride. And maybe, somewhere under the polish and the crowd, that boy still exists. Maybe he's just buried under layers of pride, shame, and the dangerous music of applause. But as I sat there, listening to the silence of the house, I wondered something I'd never dared before. What if the boy I raised is gone? What if all that's left is the young man who called me useless? The thought hurt more than the word itself. There are men who measure their worth by titles on business cards, by square footage of a home, by the shine of a car in the driveway. I measured mine by the number of shifts I could string together without collapsing. For years, my life was a 2-act play. Daylight belonged to one job, nightfall to another. At sunrise, I hauled freight at the shipping yard. Steel-toed boots sinking into gravel, back bent under crates heavier than regrets. The air always smelled of diesel and salt. A reminder that everything in this country moves because someone somewhere breaks his body to move it. I was that someone, my hands hardened into callus upon callus. My spine learned the language of aches, but the paycheck kept the lights on, and that was enough. Then when others went home to recliners and television, I changed uniforms and headed to the school district's cleaning crew. A mop, a bucket, an empty hallway with lockers yawning like tired mouths. I scrubbed gum from floors, polished the shine into linoleum that children would scuff the next morning without thought. The janitor's closet smelled of bleach and loneliness. Midnight was my coworker. 2 jobs, 2 worlds, same man, same purpose, Ethan. Every dollar had a name on it before it left my hand. Camp fees, cleats, team trips to out-of-state tournaments. Protein shakes the coach swore by. Gas for the van that carried him to practices miles away. I became an accountant of sacrifice, balancing books written in sweat. I used to joke with myself that I had 3 full-time jobs, 2 that paid and 1 that didn't. Fatherhood. Only the third was the only one that mattered. Sometimes when I dragged myself into the night shift, the hallways empty except for my mop, I would imagine Ethan years later under real stadium lights, a scholarship in his pocket, his future shining brighter than the wax on the floors I buffed. That vision kept me upright when my knees begged to fold, but the body doesn't always stay loyal to the dream. There were nights I nodded off at a red light, the horn of the car behind me yanking me back. There were mornings I gripped my thermos so hard just to feel something warm in my fingers because the rest of me was numb. My doctor warned me once about blood pressure, about exhaustion. I laughed it off. I told him fathers don't get to collapse. We only get to keep moving, and move I did. Day into night, night into day, until time blurred. Ethan grew taller, faster, stronger. My shoulders slumped, my hair thinned, my gait slowed. That was the bargain, his rise for my decline. People sometimes asked why I worked myself like that. They said kids grow up fast, they'd forget the details, and maybe they're right. Maybe Ethan won't remember the way my hands shook when I signed the check for his summer league. Maybe he won't remember the smell of my uniform when I hugged him after a 16-hour day. Maybe he won't even remember the small box of coins I kept on my dresser, labeled Ethan's future, where every tip and spare dollar went. But I remember. And fathers don't keep ledgers of thanks, we keep ledgers of love. That was my double burden, to break my body for him, and to carry the silence when the world didn't notice. Dreams don't always vanish in a single night. Sometimes they dissolve quietly, piece by piece, traded away for someone else's tomorrows. I once had a dream of my own. It wasn't much by the world's standards. A small cabin up north, near a lake where the water freezes thick enough to skate in winter and sings with loons in summer. I pictured weekends spent fishing, books stacked by the window, the kind of silence that heals a man's tired bones. I even kept a brochure once. Folded neatly in the drawer by my bed, that brochure is gone now. One day I traded the down payment for Ethan's summer camp fee, the one that promised elite training and college scouts guaranteed. The cabin drifted away like a boat untied from the dock, and I never chased it. There were other sacrifices, quieter still. When neighbors asked me to join their bowling league, I said no. The fee was the cost of new cleats. When coworkers invited me on a weekend trip to Chicago, I passed. That was tournament money. When an old friend suggested I try dating again years after Ethan's mother left, I smiled and said I was too busy. The truth, I didn't want anyone to divide my focus, to take even a fraction of the attention I owed my son. Love could wait, fatherhood could not. I stopped buying myself new clothes unless absolutely necessary. My boots had more patches than leather. My jacket carried winters on its shoulders long after it stopped keeping out the cold, but Ethan never stepped onto a field without looking the part. His jersey was always crisp, his gear always polished. That mattered more than whether I shivered on the sidelines. And then there was the guitar. Long before my hands stiffened from freight work and bleach water, I used to strum. Not well, but enough to fill an evening with melody. Music gave me a little corner of joy that belonged only to me. But one year, when Ethan's asthma medication bills piled up higher than expected, I sold the guitar. The pawn shop clerk gave me less than it was worth. I walked out with cash in my pocket and an emptiness in my chest. Ethan never knew. He never had to. That was the point of a father's sacrifice, to make it invisible, to let the child believe life just works out that way. I told myself these losses weren't really losses. They were investments. investments in his speed, his strength, his chance to become more than I ever was, and for years that was enough. But sitting alone at the kitchen table now, with the word useless still echoing from his mouth to my marrow, I couldn't help but ask myself, what becomes of all those sacrifices when the person you gave them to forgets? Do they still count if they go unremembered? I looked down at my hands, calloused, cracked, empty of guitars, empty of brochures, empty of promises made to myself, yet somehow still full of the weight of a boy's future. Silent sacrifices. They had been my currency, my prayer, my proof of love, and the cruelest part, love doesn't leave receipts. Every boy has a first love. For Ethan, it wasn't a girl from school or a video game glowing on a screen. It was a pair of cleats. I still remember the day. He was 9, maybe 10, small enough that his knees were knobby sticks, but big enough to dream with both eyes wide open. We'd stopped by a sporting goods store on the edge of town. He pressed his face against the glass like a kid staring into a candy shop. Only this candy was leather and laces, shining under fluorescent lights. "Dad," he whispered as if the shoes could hear him, "if I had those, I'd be faster. I know I would." I laughed because children believe the right shoes can make them fly, but when he turned to me, his eyes weren't joking. They burned with a hunger I'd only ever seen on professional fields, the kind of hunger that doesn't ask, it begs. The price tag mocked me. More than I made in a single night's cleaning shift, more than I should have even considered. I told him we'd see. He nodded, quiet, but I could feel his disappointment trailing behind us as we walked out of the store empty-handed. For weeks after, he kept drawing those cleats in the margins of his homework, little stick-figure boys wearing big shoes, streaking across imaginary fields. Every time I found one of those drawings crumpled in the trash or left on the kitchen table, it was like a quiet reminder, he's still waiting. So I worked. Extra hours at the yard, extra classrooms to scrub. I skipped dinners that cost more than bread and beans. I sold the old radio I'd kept from my teenage years. Small sacrifices, each one cutting into me like tiny blades until finally I held enough folded bills to make it happen. I remember the feel of the box in my hands, cardboard, ordinary to anyone else, but to me it felt heavier than gold. I wrapped it in plain paper, no ribbon. I wasn't a man for ribbons. When Ethan opened it, his face cracked wide with disbelief. He touched the cleats like they were made of glass, his little hands trembling. "Dad," he breathed, his voice breaking in that way children's voices do when their hearts are too full. "These are mine, they are yours," I said, my throat tight. He threw his arms around me, squeezing with all the strength a boy's thin arms could muster. "You're my hero," he whispered. It's strange how words can carve themselves into you. That night, sitting at the edge of his bed while he refused to take those shoes off, I thought I'd been given the greatest reward a father could ever earn, to be his child's hero. I didn't know then that heroes grow old, and sometimes in the eyes of the very children who once worshipped them, heroes become useless. But on that night the world was simple, a boy in his cleats, a father in his sacrifice, and a promise, unspoken but etched in both our hearts, that no matter how hard the world became, we had each other. At least I thought we did. Families don't always break with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they slip apart in the quiet, like a rope fraying strand by strand until it gives way. Ethan's mother didn't storm out in a fit of rage. She faded. At first, it was small things. Nights when she stayed late at work, claiming deadlines. Weekends when she suddenly had plans with friends. Then came the sighs whenever Ethan's practices ran long. The way she rolled her eyes when I reminded her of his asthma medication, the distance in her voice when she said, "You two have this under control, don't you?" The truth, we didn't, not really, but I said yes anyway. Fathers say yes even when their bones say no. One morning when Ethan was barely 6, I woke to find her side of the closet half empty. Shirts gone, shoes missing, perfume bottles no longer cluttering the dresser. On the counter, next to the coffee maker she never once remembered to clean, sat a single folded note. It didn't say much, just that she was tired, that life had asked more of her than she had to give, that she couldn't carry the weight of a sick boy and a broke husband who never seemed to stop working. Her last line, "I need to find myself again." I wanted to scream that families aren't scavenger hunts. You don't leave a child behind while you go searching for yourself. But the only sound that morning was Ethan padding into the kitchen, hair sticking up in tufts, clutching his blanket. He asked, "Where's Mom?" in the small, shaky voice of a boy who hadn't yet learned that some questions have answers you'll never want to hear. I swallowed hard, pulled him onto my lap, and said the only thing I could. She had to go, buddy, but I'm here. I'll always be here. And from that day forward, I meant it with every muscle, every hour, every sacrifice. It changed everything. I became the parent who packed lunches, who signed permission slips, who sat in two small chairs at parent-teacher conferences. I was the one who paced the living room during asthma attacks, whispering promises into the night air. I learned how to braid hair for crazy hat day at school, only to be told it didn't matter because his mother wasn't there to see it. I wore both hats, mother and father, until neither fit, and I just called it life. People told me kids are resilient, they bounce back. Maybe they do, but fathers don't bounce. We break, then we carry. For years, I carried Ethan's questions that I couldn't answer. Why doesn't mom come to my games? Doesn't she love us? I wanted to protect him from the truth, so I painted her absence as something softer. She's busy, son. She's trying to figure things out. I made excuses for a woman who had already left her seat empty. But inside, every time I saw the disappointment flicker across his face when the stands filled with mothers and mine stayed bare, I made a vow. I would cheer loud enough for two. I would love enough for two. I would sacrifice enough for two, and I did. What I didn't know then was that love, when stretched thin to cover someone else's absence, phrase too. That sometimes, no matter how much you give, a child will look at the missing piece and blame the parent who stayed. Still, on the nights when exhaustion pressed me flat, I whispered the same promise I had made that morning she left. I'm here. I'll always be here. I kept that promise, even when it cost me everything. 16 is an age that changes everything. For Ethan, it was the year his world began to stretch beyond my reach. By then, his talent was undeniable. Coaches noticed him. Recruiters circled like hawks around a rising star. Parents with deep pockets and polished SUVs began inviting him over, families whose kitchens gleamed with granite counters, whose refrigerators were stocked with sports drinks and protein bars I could never afford. I remember watching him slip into their homes, shoulders squared, eyes hungry for more than just food. He was tasting a life that smelled of ease, of status, of a mother's presence at every game, of fathers who didn't come home smelling like bleach or diesel. And I, sitting in the bleachers, boots caked in warehouse dust, began to fade into the background. At first, it was subtle. He stopped asking me to tape his ankles before practice. He said, "Coach does it better." He no longer looked for me in the stands after a goal. His eyes scanned the recruiters instead. Then came the words I'll never forget. One night, after I reminded him to get his homework done, he snapped, "Dad, you don't get it. You never played. You don't know this world. You just hold me back." The words landed like stones. Hold him back. After years of working 2 jobs, of sleeping on a couch so he could have the bed, of giving up dreams so he could chase his, I had become the obstacle. It wasn't just me he was pushing away. It was the shadow of a missing mother, too. I could see it in the way he lingered at his friends' houses, watching their moms cheer from the stands, hug sweaty shoulders after a game. He never said it out loud, but the absence haunted him. And in his teenage mind, the only place to throw that hurt was at me, the one who stayed. 16 made him restless. Restless for freedom, for luxury, for recognition. Restless to escape the smell of my worn-out jacket, the sight of me counting crumpled bills at the gas station before filling the tank. And little by little, my boy who once hugged me tight over a pair of cleats began to see me not as his hero, but as his burden. I told myself it was a phase. Teenagers rebel. They say things they don't mean. But late at night, when I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the faded brochure of that cabin by the lake I once dreamed of, I couldn't escape the truth. The world was teaching Ethan that love measured in sweat and sacrifice was less valuable than love measured in dollars and applause. And at 16, he was starting to believe it. It happened on a Saturday afternoon under a sky so blue it looked almost cruel. The school had arranged a scrimmage with a rival academy, the kind of game recruiters circle in their calendars. Parents filled the bleachers, some in polo shirts and designer sunglasses, others waving banners with their kids' names. I sat at the far end, same as always, boots muddy from the morning shift at the yard. I didn't mind, I never minded, as long as Ethan saw me there cheering. I was proud. That day he played brilliantly, fast, sharp, every move calculated. Coaches whispered, nodding, I could feel it, his future was knocking. My chest swelled with a mix of pride and relief. All those nights working 2 jobs, all the meals I'd skipped, all the sleep I'd lost, it was finally paying off. After the match, the team gathered with parents and coaches on the field. A scout, clean suit, firm handshake, stepped forward and asked Ethan in front of everyone, "Son, been your biggest influence? Who's pushed you to get here?" I held my breath. Just a second, just one heartbeat. Ethan looked around. His eyes swept the crowd, lingered on the polished faces of his teammates' families, and then, just for a fraction of a second, met mine. And then he smiled at the scout and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "My coach, he's like a father to me." The world went quiet, or maybe it was just me. I felt the words like a blade, twisting slow, like a father to me. Not my father, not the man who worked double shifts, who sold his own dreams for a boy's pair of cleats, not the man who stayed when others left. The scout nodded, impressed. The crowd clapped politely. The coach put a hand on Ethan's shoulder, beaming with pride, and I stood frozen, as if my boots had grown roots in the dirt. One of the other parents glanced at me, then away quickly, as though ashamed on my behalf. I tried to swallow, but my throat burned. I wanted to shout, "That's my boy, I raised him, I bled for him." But fathers like me don't shout, we endure, so I did what I always did. I smiled, a small, crooked smile that fooled no one, not even myself. Later in the car, I waited for him to say something, anything, an apology. I half-whispered, "I didn't mean it, Dad," but Ethan just scrolled through his phone, laughing at a teammate's joke. Headphones already in his ears. To him, the moment was gone, forgotten. To me, it was the first crack in something I had thought unbreakable. And once a crack appears, it only grows. Some memories don't fade because they're carved not in stone, but in water. They live in the sound of rain, in the smell of damp earth, in the way a father stands alone while the world moves on without him. That night, the sky opened up just as practice ended. It wasn't a drizzle, it was the kind of heavy, punishing rain that soaks through jackets in minutes and makes the field into a swamp. Parents scrambled for cover under the aluminum awning by the gym entrance, chatting, laughing, passing around towels. Coaches huddled with scouts, protected by wide umbrellas. And me, I stood at the curb, no umbrella, no awning, just me, the rain, and the rusted hood of my pickup truck. I had left work early, slipping out of my shift so I could be there on time. My boots squelched in the puddles as I leaned against the truck, waiting for Ethan to come out. The rain drummed against my shoulders, trickled down my collar. My shirt clung to me like a second skin. But I didn't care. I'd stood in worse storms. Through the sheets of rain, I saw him, Ethan, walking out with a group of teammates, his duffel bag slung effortlessly across his back. They laughed, their voices carrying even over the downpour. At the center of them was Coach, shielding them with a massive umbrella, cracking jokes, a hero in their eyes. For a moment, Ethan glanced toward the parking lot, toward me. Our eyes nearly met, but then one of his friends called his name. And just like that, he turned away. He didn't wave, he didn't smile, he didn't acknowledge me at all. Instead, he followed the group under the safety of the awning, laughing at something the coach said, as if he belonged to them and not to me. I stood there in the open, drenched. The rain beat harder, plastering my hair to my forehead. Parents whispered, stealing glances. I could feel their eyes, some pitying, others smug. All of them confirming what Ethan was beginning to believe. I didn't belong in his world. Minutes stretched long. I wanted to step forward to call his name, to say, "Son, your ride's here, your father's here." But my voice caught in my throat, drowned out by the storm, so I waited. I waited while he joked with his friends. I waited while the coach clapped him on the shoulder like he was his own son. I waited until the crowd thinned and the rain began to ease. Finally, Ethan walked toward the truck, not with gratitude, not even with recognition, but with the reluctant steps of someone tethered to a past he no longer wanted. He opened the door, threw his bag in, and sank into the seat without a word. Water dripped from my chin as I climbed in after him. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. I wanted to ask why. Why couldn't he look at me the way he looked at them? Why did he let me stand in the rain like a stranger? But instead, I just turned the key and drove. The windshield wipers beat back and forth, a steady rhythm against the silence between us. And that's when I realized, sometimes storms don't break families apart, they just reveal the cracks already there. The cab of my old pickup truck had always been a kind of sanctuary. When Ethan was younger, those drives home were filled with chatter, him kicking his legs, replaying every goal, every pass, every scrape on his knees as though I were the press conference he couldn't wait to hold. He would fill the silence with dreams. "One day, Dad, I'll play in a stadium so big you won't even see the top row." But now the silence filled the cab instead. The rain was still falling. A softer drizzle against the windshield. The wipers dragged back and forth with a tired squeak, the only sound beside the low rumble of the engine. Ethan sat slouched in the passenger seat, hood up, earbuds jammed in. His world was sealed away, somewhere between the glowing screen of his phone and the echoes of his teammates' laughter still ringing in his head. I glanced at him once, just once, hoping to catch his eye to anchor him back to me, but he didn't look. His reflection in the window showed only a boy already reaching for a future that no longer needed me in it. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. My knuckles whitened, 1,000 words pressed against my throat. Son, I'm proud of you. Don't forget where you came from. Don't shut me out. But every word felt like it would shatter in the air between us. Instead, I listened to the hum of the road in the rain, and I thought about the years that had led us here, the double shifts. The bruised hands, the meals skipped. I thought of the little boy who once leaned against me, sweaty and smiling, telling me that I was his hero, and I wondered how long it had been since he last said those words. The silence grew heavier with each mile. It was more than just a lack of conversation. It was a wall, brick by brick, being built between father and son, and I could feel myself standing on the outside, watching him disappear behind it, at one red light. I almost spoke. I almost told him about the rain soaking me outside the gym, how it felt like the world itself was pushing me aside. I almost said, Ethan, don't forget who stood there waiting. But the light turned green and my words turned to dust. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I realized something chilling. The ride home, once our time together, had become just transportation. A task, a duty, nothing more. He opened the door without looking at me, muttered a half-hearted thanks, and disappeared into the house, leaving me alone in the cab. The rain tapped softly on the roof as if mocking the emptiness inside me, and I sat there, staring at the darkened windshield, realizing that sometimes silence screams louder than any insult.
Some wounds don't bleed. They don't leave scars that anyone else can see. They just sit beneath the skin, quiet, festering, invisible to the world but impossible to ignore. That night, after Ethan vanished into his room without so much as a glance, I stayed in the truck longer than I should have. The rain had stopped, but I kept the engine running, staring at the faint trail of steam curling from the exhaust. It felt safer there, in the cab, in the hum of the motor, than stepping inside a house that no longer felt like home. When I finally went in, the place was silent. Ethan's door was closed, music leaking faintly through the crack. I thought about knocking, about asking how practice went, about reminding him that I'd been there, waiting, soaked through to the bone. But my hand hovered in the air and then fell. Some walls can't be scaled, especially when they're built by your own child. I went to my room instead, sat on the edge of the bed, and that's when it hit me. The pain wasn't just in what Ethan had said or hadn't said. It was in the contrast, in the memory of who he used to be. I remembered his tiny hand clutching mine as we crossed parking lots. I remembered the night he came down with a fever, his little body trembling, and how he whispered, "Don't leave me, Dad." I remembered the glow in his eyes when I surprised him with that first pair of cleats, how he slept with them at the foot of his bed like they were treasure. Those memories used to give me strength, but now they felt like salt rubbed into an open wound, because the boy who once thought I was his whole world now treated me like a shadow, an inconvenience, a relic from a past he no longer claimed. I lay back on the mattress, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked with the sound of pipes, the buzz of the refrigerator, the muffled laughter from Ethan's phone upstairs. Each sound reminded me how far apart we were, even while under the same roof. I thought about calling someone, an old friend maybe. But who would understand? Who could I tell that my son, the very reason I had worked my body to exhaustion, the reason I had given up dreams I'd never get back, was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it? The truth pressed down on me like a weight. Sacrifice can turn to suffering when it goes unseen. And that was my wound. Not the calluses on my hands, not the aches in my bones, but the knowledge that the years I had given, the very marrow of my life, were now invisible to the one person they were meant for. I rolled onto my side, trying to sleep, but my chest burned as though something inside me was breaking, splinter by splinter. I didn't cry. Fathers don't cry, not where anyone can see. But inside, something bled quietly. And I knew this was just the beginning.
Lies rarely begin with malice. They often start small, just a flicker of shame, a moment of hesitation, a decision to hide the truth because the truth feels too heavy to carry. But even the smallest lie once spoken begins to unravel something larger. It happened one Saturday morning, the day of a big scrimmage that scouts were rumored to attend. I had rearranged my shifts, begged a coworker to cover for me so I could sit in the stands and cheer for Ethan. I wanted to be there not just as his father, but as proof for myself that all the sacrifices still meant something. I arrived early, sitting alone on the bleachers with my thermos of stale coffee, watching the field glisten under the morning sun. One by one, parents gathered, shaking hands with coaches, trading stories about private trainers and expensive summer camps. Their laughter carried like music I was never meant to dance to. And then I heard it, a boy's voice, confident, casual, answering a question from one of his teammates. "Who's that man sitting over there?" a boy asked, pointing toward the stands. Ethan barely flinched. He shrugged, stuffed his hands in his pockets, and said, "Oh, him, just a neighbor. Sometimes he helps out, drives me around when my parents are busy." The words cut deeper than any insult. A neighbor, not a father, just someone who helps out. The other boys nodded, accepting the lie without question. One of them laughed. "Well, he looks like he's here for you." Ethan smiled awkwardly, then steered the conversation back to the game, desperate to bury the slip beneath the noise of teenage banter. From my seat, I couldn't hear every word, but I saw enough. The way his eyes flickered away from me, the nervous laugh, the subtle distance he placed between us. I knew a father knows. I gripped the thermos so tightly my hand ached. I wanted to stand up, to shout across the field. "I'm not a neighbor, I'm his father, his only father, and I've bled for every step that brought him here." But I stayed seated. I swallowed the humiliation like bitter medicine. The game went on. Ethan played well, nimble, fierce, a natural leader on the field. Parents cheered, coaches nodded approvingly. And still I sat in silence, clapping softly when he scored, my pride tangled with a pain so sharp it left me dizzy. Afterward, he jogged over, sweat dripping, a smile tugging at his lips. For a moment, he almost looked like the boy I remembered, the boy who used to run into my arms after practice, grinning as if I had built the world for him. But then he caught sight of his teammates watching from a distance. His smile faded. Thanks for coming," he muttered quickly, eyes darting around. "You can, head home. I'll get a ride with Coach." I nodded, forcing a smile, pretending his words didn't crack something deeper inside me. As I walked back to the truck, the thermos still clutched in my hand, I realized that lies aren't just about words. They're about erasure. And with one casual sentence, my son had erased me from his story, and nothing hurts more than being alive and already forgotten. The drive home felt endless, though it was only a handful of miles. My hands gripped the steering wheel as if letting go might send me spinning into the dark. The streets were wet, reflecting neon lights that shimmered like ghosts on the asphalt. My eyes blurred not from the rain, but from the weight pressing against them. When I finally pulled into the lot outside my rented room, the engine ticked as it cooled, echoing in the night air. I sat there, motionless. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened, cars rushing by, a dog barking in the alley, the faint hum of a TV from a neighbor's window. But inside me, something had collapsed. The room greeted me with the same stale smell of damp wood and old takeout containers. The wallpaper peeled in the corners, the ceiling carried a brown stain from a leak I never had the money to fix. It wasn't much of a home, it was survival, and even survival had become a kind of cage. I sank onto the bed, its springs groaning beneath me, and buried my face in my hands. The silence pressed in. It was the kind of silence that doesn't comfort but accuses, reminding you that you are alone, that no one is coming, that the people you gave your life to no longer see you. And then the memories returned, sharp and merciless. I saw myself years ago, rushing through city streets on a bicycle at midnight, a thermal bag strapped to my back, delivering meals for strangers while Ethan slept. Every pedal stroke was for him, for tuition, for gear, for rent. I remembered coming home drenched in sweat and rain, tiptoeing into his room to kiss his forehead, whispering, "Dad's here, you're safe." I saw myself in hospital waiting rooms, my heart hammering as nurses rushed Ethan down sterile halls. Pneumonia, they had said. I had stayed by his bed for 3 nights, refusing to leave. holding his tiny hand while machines beeped and hissed. He had squeezed my fingers and murmured, "Don't go, Daddy." And now the boy who once begged me never to leave had pushed me out of his story with a single lie. The tears came suddenly, hot and humiliating. My chest heaved as I tried to choke them back, but there was no one to see, no one to judge. The sobs ripped through me in waves, years of exhaustion and quiet sacrifice breaking loose all at once. I pressed my fist against my mouth, but the sound still escaped, ragged and raw. It was not just grief, it was betrayal. A betrayal so profound it made me question whether love itself had been an illusion. When the tears finally slowed, I lay back on the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. My body trembled with fatigue, my eyes burned, and in that hollow silence I understood a cruel truth. Sometimes fathers don't collapse in front of the world. They collapse in rented rooms, unseen, unheard, forgotten. And yet, even in the ruin of that moment, I knew I would wake tomorrow, drag myself to work, and keep going, because love doesn't die easily, even when it is beaten down, even when it is denied. But tonight, John, the father, the worker, the dreamer, lay broken in the dark, weeping for a son who no longer saw him. Life has a cruel way of revealing truths, not in grand declarations, but in fragments, overheard words, chance encounters. For weeks I had been wondering why Ethan's distance had hardened into something colder, sharper. It wasn't just teenage rebellion anymore, it was conviction, as if someone had whispered in his ear that I was no longer enough. And then one evening I found the answer. I had stopped by the training grounds after work, still in my grease-stained uniform, just to catch a glimpse of my son. I didn't plan to approach him. I had learned by now that my presence embarrassed him. I only wanted to see him run, to remind myself why all those years of double shifts and sleepless nights mattered. As I lingered by the fence, hidden in the shadow of a dim street lamp, I saw her. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with blonde highlights that caught the fading sun. She wore expensive clothes, the kind that looked effortless but cost more than I made in a week. And beside her, laughing softly, was Ethan, his mother, the woman who had left when he was barely 7. The woman who hadn't written, hadn't called, hadn't stayed by his hospital bed when pneumonia nearly stole him from me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. They stood close, too close. Ethan smiled at her in a way I hadn't seen him smile at me in years, wide, unguarded, as if she had simply walked back into his life and taken the place I had bled to hold. And then, like a knife, I heard the words. "Ethan," she said, her hand resting on his shoulder, "you're special. You don't want to end up like your father, always working, always tired, always stuck. You were meant for more. Surround yourself with people who can take you higher. Don't let anyone, especially him, hold you back." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes downcast, but his silence was agreement enough. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear down the fence and shout, "How dare you? How dare she, after years of absence, return only to poison him against me? How dare she plant shame in the heart of a boy I had raised with nothing but sacrifice and love?" But I stayed in the shadows. My fingers dug into the chain-link fence until they ached. My throat burned with words I could never speak. Ethan glanced toward the field, and for a fleeting second his eyes brushed mine. Did he see me standing there? Did he recognize the man in the shadows? Or had the poison already done its work, making me invisible to him? He turned back to her, his smile returning, and in that moment I felt something inside me splinter. That night, lying awake in my crumbling room, I realized the cruelest truth of all. I was no longer just losing my son to ambition, to pride, to the glitter of a world I could never give him. I was losing him to her, the woman who had abandoned us both and who now returned not with love but with contempt. And worse still, Ethan seemed ready to follow her voice. Promises are strange things. When spoken, they feel like anchors, binding hearts together, securing love against the storms of life. But over time, some promises don't hold. They slip, they fray, and eventually they vanish like mist. I remember the night Ethan made his. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The world outside was quiet, the kind of winter evening where the wind rattled the windows and the heater groaned to keep the cold at bay. Ethan had climbed into my bed after a nightmare, his small frame trembling under the blanket. His cheeks were wet, his breaths uneven. "Dad," he whispered, clutching my hand tightly, "you won't ever leave me, right?" I kissed his hair and said the only thing a father could, "Never, son, never." And then after a pause, he sat up, eyes glistening with a seriousness far beyond his years. "Then I won't ever leave you either, Dad, no matter what, I promise." He said it with such conviction, as if the words themselves could build a fortress no one could tear down. I remember smiling through my own tears, pulling him close, whispering, "That's all I need, Ethan. That's all I'll ever need." That promise became my fuel. On nights when exhaustion nearly broke me, when my body screamed for rest but bills demanded otherwise, I clung to those words. "I won't ever leave you, Dad." They were my light in the dark, my reason for each sacrifice. But now, years later, I could feel that light dimming. Ethan didn't remember that night, or if he did, it meant nothing to him now. I saw it in the way he avoided my eyes, in the way he flinched when teammates spotted me in the stands. I heard it in the excuses he mumbled, the lies he thought I couldn't detect. One afternoon after practice, I tried to remind him. He was scrolling through his phone, laughing at something a teammate had sent. "Ethan," I said softly, "do you remember that night when you promised me you'd never leave?" His expression shifted, annoyance flickering where nostalgia should have been. He gave a quick shrug, muttered, "Dad, I was a kid. I didn't know what I was saying." Those words stung more than any insult ever could, because in them was a truth I wasn't ready to face. To him, that promise was nothing but a childish whim, forgotten as easily as old toys or outgrown shoes. But to me, it was everything. That night, back in my dimly lit room, I sat staring at the ceiling, replaying his words. I was a kid. I didn't know what I was saying, over and over, like a cruel refrain. It struck me then how fragile devotion can be, how something sacred to one heart can be disposable to another. And in the silence, I whispered into the dark as if he could hear me. "Ethan, I never let go of my promise. Even if you break yours, I never will." Glory has a way of finding the spotlight. It doesn't care who paid the electric bill that kept the lights on, or who swept the floor after the crowd had gone home. Glory only wants the golden smiles, the victorious poses, the names that sell papers. That's how it was the morning I unfolded the local sports section. There across the front page was Ethan, his face lit with triumph, his arm draped around his coach's shoulder, his mother standing elegantly beside him. The headline read, "Rising Star, Ethan Carter, the Future of American Soccer." The photograph captured everything the world wanted to see: talent, promise, family support. But it wasn't the headline or the words that stopped me cold. It was the background, blurred, almost unnoticeable, yet undeniably there was me. I was standing just beyond the group, half hidden by the curve of the bleachers, my work jacket still damp from the night shift. My expression was unreadable, caught between pride and exhaustion. But in that photograph, I looked less like a father and more like a shadow. A ghost haunting the edge of someone else's story. I stared at it for a long time. The coffee on the table grew cold. My hands trembled as I traced the outlines of their faces. Her perfectly poised, reclaiming a place she had abandoned. The coach beaming, his hand raised in victory. And Ethan, my son, his smile wide, bright, almost blinding. No mention of me in the article. No hint of the double shifts, the missed meals, the nights driving strangers across town just to keep cleats on his feet. The journalist described his incredible support system, but the words painted a picture where I did not exist. It felt like the world had decided my story was no longer needed, that I had been edited out of my own son's journey. I folded the paper, pressed it against my chest, and for a moment, I let myself imagine a different headline: "A father's sacrifice, the man who worked 2 jobs so his son could dream." But headlines like that don't sell. Sacrifice is quiet, invisible, forgotten. That night as I left for work, I caught my reflection in a rain-streaked window. For the first time, I truly saw what the photograph had revealed. I was becoming invisible, not just to the world, but to Ethan himself, a ghost in his story. And ghosts, I realized, don't get remembered. There are moments in life you wait years for. You endure long nights and heavy burdens because you believe deep down that one day those sacrifices will be acknowledged. That was what this game meant to me. It was Ethan's biggest match yet, a state championship, stadium lights blazing against the dark sky, the stands packed with roaring fans. Flags waved, drums pounded, voices rose in chants that made the ground tremble beneath our feet. I sat alone near the top of the bleachers, the cheap seats. My work boots were still stained from the factory, and I'd rushed straight from my shift, sweat dried into the seams of my jacket. But none of that mattered. Tonight wasn't about me. Tonight, I believed, would finally be the night Ethan looked for me in the crowd and knew, truly knew, that his father had never stopped standing in his corner. From the first whistle, Ethan was unstoppable. He moved across the field with a grace that almost defied gravity, his footwork sharp, his passes precise, his shots electric. The crowd chanted his name, Ethan, Ethan, Ethan. Each time they roared, my chest swelled with pride. Every sprint, every goal was another reminder of why I had worked 2 jobs, why I had given up dreams of my own. This was his moment, and in my heart it was ours. The final whistle blew victory. His team surged across the field, lifting him onto their shoulders. Cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, the announcer's voice thundered. The star of the night, Ethan Carter. I stood, clapping until my palms stung, my throat raw from cheering. This was it, the moment. The microphone was placed in Ethan's hand. The crowd fell into a hush, waiting for the words of the boy who had just become a hero. He smiled, breathless, and spoke. I couldn't have done this without my amazing coach, who believed in me every step of the way. The crowd cheered, and my mom, thank you for being here tonight. Your support means the world. Another roar erupted. I waited. My heart pounded against my ribs. Surely the next words would be mine. Surely after all these years he would look into the crowd, find my face, and say it, "Thank you, Dad," but the words never came. Instead, Ethan lifted the trophy high, basking in the thunder of the stadium, his eyes scanning the crowd but never meeting mine. I sank back onto the bench, the cheers crashing down around me like waves I could not breathe through. To the world, it was his moment of glory. To me, it was the sound of a promise shattering, echoing louder than the applause. When the fireworks lit up the night sky, painting everything in dazzling color, I felt only the darkness within me. For the first time, I realized Ethan no longer saw me as part of his victory. In his story, I had already been written out. And yet, as the crowd erupted, I whispered softly to myself, words no one would ever hear. That's my boy. Even in silence, I still claimed him.
When the final cheers began to fade and the fireworks dimmed into smoke, the crowd surged toward the players. Parents, friends, reporters, all pressing closer to capture a piece of glory. I tightened my grip on the railing and took a slow breath. This was my chance. I made my way down the steps, weaving through the bodies, still buzzing with excitement. My heart beat fast, not from the climb or fatigue, but from the hope that maybe, just maybe, I could stand at Ethan's side for one photo. Shake his hand. Tell him how proud I was. Near the edge of the field, I caught sight of him, still in his uniform, sweat glistening on his forehead, a medal hanging heavy on his chest. He looked older in that moment, almost like the man he was becoming. And for the briefest second, I saw the boy he used to be, the boy who once ran into my arms after every practice, shouting, "Did you see that, Dad?" I smiled and stepped forward. But before I could call his name, a hand pressed firmly against my chest. "Sir, you can't go through here," a security guard said, his tone polite but firm. I'm his father," I stammered, my voice trembling. "Just for a minute, I want to. Family and team only." He cut me off, waving me back. He didn't even look at me twice. I tried again, craning my neck to catch Ethan's eye. "Ethan, son," but my voice was swallowed by the sea of celebration. The guard pushed me back as another wave of people surged forward, journalists, photographers, school officials. Then, like salt rubbed into a wound, I saw her, his mother. She slipped easily past the guard, her hand resting lightly on the coach's arm, her smile radiant as cameras flashed around her. She was ushered forward like she belonged, while I was pressed back like an intruder. I raised my voice once more. "Desperate Ethan!" He turned for half a second. His eyes scanned the crowd, paused where I stood behind the barrier, my hand raised. For a heartbeat, I thought he saw me, that he would break through, pull me in, claim me as his father. But instead, he looked past me, toward his coach, toward his mother, toward the flashing lights that promised fame. And then he smiled. The crowd swallowed him, and I was left behind the curtain, pressed against the cold metal rail, just another stranger trying to get close to the star. I stepped back, my throat tight, my body numb. The guard gave me a look of indifference, one reserved for nobodies who had no business being near the stage of greatness. That night, walking away from the stadium, the noise still echoing behind me, I realized something unbearable. My son wasn't just moving on. He was learning to live as if I had never been there at all. I was no longer a father in his story. I was just another shadow at the edge of the frame.
The apartment was dark when I returned. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, the kind of silence that digs into your bones and makes every breath sound too loud. I sat at the small kitchen table, the wood worn thin by years of elbows leaning heavy, and stared at the calloused hands that had built a life for a boy who no longer wanted it. There was a knock at the door. For a moment, I thought maybe I imagined it. No one ever knocked on my door this late. But then it came again, steady, patient. When I opened it, Frank stood there. His shirt still smelled faintly of the factory floor, sleeves rolled up, his gray hair damp with sweat. We had worked side by side for years, on the night shifts, on the overtime Saturdays, on the jobs no one else wanted. If anyone knew what sacrifice looked like, it was him. "John," he said, his voice low but kind. "I saw the game, thought you might need some company." I stepped aside. And he entered with the familiarity of a brother. He carried 2 paper cups of black coffee still steaming from the diner down the street. He slid one toward me, sat down across the table, and for a long while we said nothing. Just the sound of the clock ticking, the city muffled outside the window. Finally, Frank spoke. "You've given that boy more than most men ever could. 2 jobs, sleepless nights, a back that'll never be the same. You built his dreams with your bare hands." He paused, eyes heavy with knowing, "And tonight he forgot you." I swallowed hard, the bitterness in my throat sharper than the coffee. "It's not just forgetting, Frank. It's like I never existed, like I'm useless." Frank leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Listen to me, John. Don't let his blindness turn into your bitterness. Don't waste what's left of your strength plotting how to make him see. Life has a way of revealing truths all on its own." He sipped his coffee. Then added softly, "The world's not always fair, but time. It has a way of humbling the proud and lifting the forgotten. You don't need to raise your voice or your fist. Your life's work is already your proof. One day he'll know, and when he does, the regret will weigh heavier than any burden you've ever carried." I sat there, staring at this man who had stood beside me in grease-stained overalls for 2 decades, realizing that in this moment, Frank was the only one still reminding me of my worth. A tired smile crept across my face. "You always did know how to talk sense." Frank chuckled, his voice rough but warm. "That's because I've lived it too. My boy turned his back on me once. Years later, when life had taken a swing at him, he came back, and when he did, I didn't need revenge. I just needed him to see me, and he did." His words lingered in the room like a small flame against the shadows. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe the world didn't need me to fight louder. Maybe it just needed me to endure a little longer. As he left that night, he clasped my shoulder and said, "Hold on, John. Fathers like you don't go unnoticed forever." And when the door closed, I sat alone again, but this time the silence wasn't quite so cruel. Frank returned a week later. The autumn wind had begun to chill, leaves scraping across the cracked pavement as he climbed the narrow stairwell to my apartment. I was still at work, but he had a spare key. I'd given it to him years ago, back when Ethan was small and I needed someone I could trust to check in if emergencies came. He stepped inside and sighed at the sight. The same dim lamp, the same unwashed coffee mug, the jacket tossed over a chair. A life that looked too worn for the man who carried it. Frank didn't come to judge, he came to understand. As he moved toward the corner of the room, his eyes landed on an old wooden box beneath the bed. The kind of box that didn't belong to clutter, the kind that held weight. Dust clung to its edges. Its corners were bruised, but the latch still worked. Frank hesitated before opening it, but when he did, the past spilled out in neat, heartbreaking order. Stacks of receipts, each one folded, faded, some stained by sweat or rain. Tuition fees for soccer camps, equipment purchases. Gas receipts from the endless drives to out-of-town tournaments. Years upon years of financial wounds, paper cuts of sacrifice. He lifted a contract from the pile, Ethan's first formal training program. At the bottom, John's signature, shaky but firm, committing to an amount he could barely afford. The ink looked almost tired, as though it had been signed with more courage than money. And then the photographs. Frank set the papers aside and pulled out a small stack of worn snapshots. Ethan in his first oversized jersey, the sleeves nearly swallowing his arms. Ethan holding his first trophy, grinning with the pure pride of a child. Ethan standing in muddy cleats with John kneeling beside him, dirt on his hands but pride in his eyes. In each picture, John looked older than his years creased. Weary but always present, always there, always behind Ethan. Frank's throat tightened. He whispered to the empty room. He kept it all. Beneath the photographs was a notebook, its cover softened by years of touch. Inside were short scribbles in John's handwriting, simple notes, half prayer, half record. 3 extra shifts this week, enough for new cleats. Skipped rent payment, but Ethan's camp is covered. Doctor said to rest my back, but how can I? Tournament fees due Friday. Ethan smiled today, that's enough. Each line was a confession, a map of devotion carved into sacrifice. Frank closed the notebook slowly, reverently, as though it were scripture. He placed everything back into the box, but not before snapping a photograph with his phone, because the world deserved to know. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, thinking of John's weary smile and Ethan's blind ambition, and then he whispered a promise almost to himself. One day when he's ready, Ethan will see, and when he does, this box will tell him the truth better than words ever could. When John came home later that night, exhausted from another double shift, Frank didn't mention the box. He simply handed him a fresh cup of diner coffee and said, "Some things, my friend, are worth keeping safe." John didn't know what Frank meant, not yet, but the proof of his sacrifice was no longer buried in dust. It was waiting, like a quiet witness, to speak when the time was right. It began with a forgotten folder. Ethan's team had just wrapped up a regional practice when one of the assistant coaches stopped by Frank's diner for a late-night coffee. He'd been coming there for years, always sitting in the same corner booth, always chatting briefly with Frank about the boys, the league, and the little dramas of youth sports. That night, Frank, tired but restless, had the wooden box beside him. He wasn't flaunting it, just flipping through the notebook again, as if reminding himself why John's sacrifice had mattered so deeply. The coach, curious, leaned closer. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the stack of receipts and photos on the table. Frank hesitated, protective of his friend's dignity. But then he thought of John's hunched shoulders, his silent grief. Slowly he slid one photograph forward, the one of John kneeling in the mud, his arm around a grinning, mud-streaked Ethan. The coach's face softened. He reached for another, the scribbled note that read, "Skipped rent payment, but Ethan's camp is covered." His brows knit together. He flipped through a few more and his jaw clenched. This is what he carried," the coach whispered. Frank only nodded. The coach didn't say much after that. He just asked if he could take a picture of one page from the notebook, just one line, one confession. Frank, after a long pause, allowed it, that night. The coach posted the photograph online. He didn't mention names. He didn't say Ethan or John. He simply wrote, "Behind every athlete you cheer for, there's often a parent you don't see. A parent who works 2 jobs, who skips meals, who sacrifices quietly. This is one line from a father's notebook I stumbled upon. 3 extra shifts this week, enough for new cleats. Think about that before you decide who the real heroes are." Within hours, post caught fire. Parents across the country shared it. Former athletes commented, confessing they had lived that story. Thousands wrote about their own mothers, fathers, guardians, the unseen labor behind their trophies. By morning, hashtags like #silent_sacrifice and #fathers like John began trending. And though no one had yet named him, people started asking, who is this father? At the diner, Frank refreshed his phone and saw strangers pouring out gratitude. "To the dad who wrote those words, thank you for reminding us. This hit me harder than any game I've ever watched." Meanwhile, John remained unaware. He was out before dawn, working his shift at the warehouse, his hands stiff with cold. He didn't know that while he stacked pallets, the world had begun stacking up evidence of his quiet heroism. By evening, a local journalist traced the post back to the coach. The coach resisted, but under pressure admitted, "It's about one of our players' fathers. He gave up everything for his boy." The article went live online that night, and for the first time, John's name appeared, just a whisper in a headline, and then the story was no longer anonymous. On forums, in Facebook groups, in late-night Twitter threads, strangers began to take John's side. Some were furious at Ethan, though his name wasn't yet plastered everywhere. Many connected the dots. Others defended him, saying young men are often blind before they grow wise. But one truth became undeniable: the story had touched a nerve. It was no longer just John's private pain. It had become a mirror for countless families, countless sacrifices, and in that mirror people saw not just Ethan, but themselves. First, Ethan thought it was just noise, a few harsh comments under a photo, a sarcastic remark from a rival fan page. He brushed them off like gnats buzzing around his head. He was Ethan Miller now, star striker, the kid with a scholarship, the future of his team. But then the noise grew into a roar. By the next week, every sports blog carried the same headline: "The Silent Sacrifice, the Father Behind the Star." Ethan scrolled furiously through his phone. Post after post, photo after photo, his name now tethered to words like ungrateful, spoiled, and heartless. Someone had even clipped the shot from the local newspaper, Ethan standing tall with his arm around his coach and mother, while in the background, half-faded, John lingered in the shadows. The caption underneath read, "The man erased from his own son's victory." The internet had found its villain. In stadium parking lots, fans began to whisper when Ethan passed. "That's the kid who abandoned his dad all those years, and he calls him useless." The sting of the words clung to Ethan's jersey tighter than sweat. During practice, teammates avoided eye contact. In the locker room, one of them muttered, "My old man worked 3 jobs for me. I'd never treat him like that." The silence that followed was worse than any insult. Then came the press conference. Cameras flashed like lightning, reporters jostling for a better shot. Ethan sat stiffly at the podium, flanked by his coach. His throat tightened when the first question cut through the air. "Ethan, the story about your father's sacrifices has gone viral. Thousands are calling you ungrateful. How do you respond?" He swallowed hard. His rehearsed lines, crafted the night before with his mother and coach, suddenly felt brittle. I'm grateful for everyone who supported me," Ethan stammered. "I wouldn't be here without the team. Without my mentors," but the reporters weren't satisfied. "And your father, the man who worked 2 jobs for years, do you deny the journal entries, the receipts, the photographs?" The room shifted. Every lens, every microphone seemed to push closer. Ethan's chest tightened. He forced a smile, but it faltered. "My relationship with my father is complicated," he said, his voice thin. "I'd prefer to keep that private." The words fell like stones. The audience heard them for what they were, not an answer, but an evasion. That evening, the headlines sharpened. Ethan Duck's question on father's sacrifices. Private or ashamed. On social media, strangers tore him apart. Complicated, try ungrateful. This kid's a millionaire in the making, but his dad's still working graveyard shifts. Memes spread, showing Ethan in his victory pose beside captions like, "Forgot who paid the price." Ethan slammed his phone shut. His hands shook. For the first time, he felt the weight of his choices not as whispers in his conscience, but as shackles on his reputation. In the quiet of his room that night, he thought of John, not the man hunched over a pallet jack, not the janitor with aching knees, but the father with calloused hands lacing up his first pair of cleats. And for a fleeting moment, guilt cracked through the armor of his pride. But just as quickly, his mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Don't be like your father, Ethan. He's a reminder of what you must rise above." Ethan shut his eyes. Torn between the applause of a world that demanded perfection and the silence of the man who had given him everything. For the first time, he realized he was no longer just playing for trophies. He was fighting against the truth of his own blood.
Ethan sat in the dim light of his apartment, the curtains drawn tight against the world outside. The roar of the crowd, the glare of cameras, the endless questions, all of it still echoed in his ears. But louder than any of those was the silence of his father. The internet storm had not quieted. Overnight, hashtags like #StandWithJohn and #Father's Sacrifice trended across platforms. Clips of John's weary figure in a factory uniform, juxtaposed with Ethan celebrating on the field, were shared millions of times. Ethan had become not just an athlete, but a symbol of ingratitude. His agent called that morning. "Ethan, listen to me. The sponsors are nervous. If you don't clean this up, we'll lose half your deals. You need to make a statement publicly. Show gratitude. Apologize if you must. But don't, for God's sake, don't drag your father on stage. That image of him, it'll ruin the brand we've built." Not long after, his mother's voice pierced the tension, crisp and cold through the phone. "Ethan, you're standing on the edge of greatness. Don't let sentiment drag you down. Your father, he chose his life. Don't let his shadow pull you back. The world respects winners, not men who mop floors." Ethan's chest tightened. He thought of John, his bent back, his trembling hands, the soft way he once whispered encouragement before every game. For a brief, dangerous second, Ethan imagined stepping in front of the cameras and telling the truth. "My father gave me everything. Without him, I wouldn't be here. He is my foundation." But then he pictured the fallout: his mother's fury, his agent's disappointment, the sponsors walking away. Would the world still cheer for him if they saw him tethered to a man the tabloids now painted as a tragic janitor, a relic of poverty? That evening, the team held a press event. Ethan stood in the locker room beforehand, staring at his reflection. His jersey clung to his body like a second skin, but in the mirror, he saw not a champion, but a son torn apart. The coach entered, resting a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Son, you've got to decide who you're playing for: the future you've built or the past that raised you." When Ethan walked onto the stage, the air thickened. Reporters leaned forward, cameras rolling. He took a long breath. "I want to thank everyone who has supported me," Ethan began, his voice steady but hollow. "My coaches, my teammates, my family." His throat caught, but he forced the next words out. "And especially my mother, who believed in me from the very beginning." The room erupted in applause. Flashbulbs lit up. Ethan smiled faintly, but inside something cracked. He had made his choice, not reconciliation, but preservation. At that very moment, John sat in a tiny diner across town, watching the press conference on a flickering television. When Ethan skipped his name, skipped his sacrifices, the old man lowered his head. He didn't cry. He simply sipped his coffee in silence, as if swallowing the last remnants of hope. Ethan had protected his image, but in doing so, he had severed the fragile thread that still bound him to his father. And in the hush of that decision, both father and son were left with a truth that neither applause nor money could erase. Some victories taste like ash.
It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind of morning where the city stirred slowly, the streets wet with dew, and newspapers were tossed onto porches with a dull thud. But this morning carried a headline that no one could ignore. Across the front page of the city's largest paper was a story that froze the community in its tracks: the silent sacrifice behind the star athlete. Beneath it was a photo, grainy, almost haunting, of John in his janitor's uniform, sitting alone on a bench outside the stadium after Ethan's last big game. The accompanying article unfolded like a confession written by time itself. Frank, John's old friend, had quietly given the journalist access to John's box of receipts, contracts, and journals. Every page, every crumpled piece of paper told the same truth. John had shouldered 2 jobs, mortgaged his health, and given up every ounce of personal happiness to fund his son's dream. There were images, too: John at the hospital with a younger Ethan, cradling him through a fever. John delivering packages at midnight, exhaustion carved into his face. John pawning his watch, the only heirloom from his father, to pay for Ethan's first summer training camp. The article did not preach. It simply laid bare the evidence, leaving readers to fill the silence with outrage, sorrow, and shame. Within hours, the story spread online. Local radio hosts recounted John's sacrifices with trembling voices. National sports networks debated not Ethan's statistics, but his humanity. Hashtags surged again, fiercer this time: #John's son, #honor your father, #silent hero. Meanwhile, John sat in his small room, unaware of the storm he had become. He only knew that his phone buzzed endlessly with messages he didn't have the strength to answer. He hadn't sought recognition. He had only wanted Ethan to remember, but Ethan couldn't escape it now. He woke to a barrage of calls from sponsors, teammates, and reporters. The locker room, once a place of triumph, felt like a courtroom. Eyes followed him not with admiration, but judgment. At practice, the usually boisterous banter died when he entered. A teammate muttered, "Man, I read about your dad. How could you not?" The words hung heavy, unfinished, but deadly enough. That night, a press conference was scheduled. Ethan stood behind the curtain, heart racing, knowing there was no script to save him anymore. For the first time, the decision wasn't whether to protect his image or not. The choice was simpler, harsher: face the truth or be consumed by it. On the other side of the curtain, hundreds of reporters waited, their pens ready to carve his answer into tomorrow's headlines. And somewhere, perhaps unknowingly watching, sat John, the man who had sacrificed everything, waiting not for applause, not for fame, but for something far rarer, acknowledgement. The truth had broken free, and now it was Ethan's turn to decide whether to carry it or let it bury him. The press room was suffocating. Cameras clicked like a relentless metronome, each flash a demand for answers. Ethan sat stiffly behind the microphone, his hands clenched together so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. For a long moment he couldn't speak. His throat felt paralyzed, as if the words were lodged deep, rusted shut by years of pride. The moderator whispered, "You need to say something, son." Ethan raised his eyes, and for the first time the swagger was gone. No arrogance, no shield of bravado, just a boy trapped inside a man's body, suddenly aware of the wreckage he had caused. His voice cracked, the first word tumbling out like a broken bone. The cameras zoomed closer, the reporters leaned in. "I've read what's been written, I've seen the photos, and I can't deny any of it." A murmur rippled through the room. Ethan swallowed hard. "My father, John Miller, he worked 2 jobs for years. He sacrificed his health, his happiness, his entire life for me. Every pair of cleats, every camp, every game, it all came from him." And his voice faltered. He bit his lip, his chest heaving as if the weight of all those unsaid truths had finally become too heavy. And I turned my back on him. Silence, a silence so deep it cut through the static of the cameras. Reporters stopped scribbling, even the moderator lowered his head. "I called him useless," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "I denied him, I pretended he wasn't there because I thought he embarrassed me. But the truth is," he paused, choking back tears, "I was the embarrassment, not him, never him." The words hung in the air, raw and unpolished, but real. Somewhere in the back of the room, unnoticed at first, stood John. His old jacket soaked from the drizzle outside, his cap pulled low. He hadn't planned to come, but Frank had insisted. And now, as his son's voice cracked under the weight of his own shame, John felt the world around him blur. Ethan's eyes darted to the crowd. For a second he froze. There, between a cameraman and a reporter, was his father. Not as a ghost in the background, not as a shadow blurred in a photo, but as flesh and bone. Their eyes met, and in that silent collision of gazes, years of unspoken love and betrayal crashed together. Ethan's face crumpled. He left the podium, ignoring the cries of the reporters, and crossed the room. When he reached John, he didn't care about the cameras, didn't care about the world watching. He dropped to his knees before his father. "Dad," his voice was broken, childlike, desperate. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I don't deserve you, I never did." John's hands trembled. He had dreamed of hearing these words, yet never believed he would. Slowly he reached out, placing a weathered hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're my son," he whispered, his own voice thick with tears. "That's all I ever wanted you to remember." And in that moment, under the unyielding glare of cameras, before a world that had judged them both, a father forgave and a son finally remembered. But forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. The apology had come, yes, yet the scars of neglect and betrayal still lingered like faint bruises under the skin. The question remained, was it too late to rebuild what had been broken? The crowd erupted with flashes, cheers, and tears. Headlines were already writing themselves. But for John and Ethan, the moment was not about the public. It was about something far more fragile, far more powerful. The first crack of light breaking into years of darkness. The night after the press conference, the city seemed quieter than usual. Or maybe it was Ethan's own heartbeat, loud and heavy, that drowned out every other sound. He drove without telling anyone where he was going, his expensive car cutting through streets he hadn't traveled in years. Streets lined with cracked sidewalks, dim street lamps, and the faint smell of fried food lingering from corner diners. Streets that once belonged to him and his father. Finally, he pulled up outside a small, weather-worn apartment complex. The kind of place no rising star would want to be seen near. But this wasn't about appearances, not anymore. He climbed the creaking stairs, his palms sweating as he stopped at a door with peeling paint and a dent near the handle. His father's door. He knocked, once, twice. The sound echoed too loudly in the narrow hallway. The door opened slowly, and there he was, John, his face tired. His eyes shadowed by sleepless years, yet still carrying that unshakable dignity. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The silence itself was a mirror, forcing Ethan to see what he had become. Dad, Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. I came to, but John lifted a hand, stopping him. His tone was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that weighed heavier than anger. I worked 2 jobs for you, son, John said quietly. 2 jobs that broke my back. Stole my sleep and kept food on the table, but respect, his eyes, worn yet steady, locked onto Ethan's. Respect is something you can't buy, you lost it yourself. The words landed harder than any shouted curse could. Ethan's chest tightened, tears stung his eyes. He wanted to fall to his knees again to beg for forgiveness, but something inside told him this wasn't the moment for begging. This was the moment for listening. John stepped back, leaving the doorway open. If you want to come in, he said softly, you come as my son, not as some celebrity looking for redemption. Do you understand? Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. He stepped inside. The apartment was sparse, faded curtains, a couch patched with old fabric, a small table stacked with unopened bills. And yet everywhere he looked there were traces of himself. A photo of his first soccer game, a trophy from middle school, the framed newspaper clipping of his first local. John had kept them all. Even when Ethan had erased his father from his world, John had never erased him from his. For a long time, neither spoke. The hum of the old refrigerator filled the silence. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, his hands shaking, while John leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching his son with the wary eyes of a man who had learned not to trust too easily. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. I don't know how to fix this, Dad. I don't know if I can, but I don't want to lose you, not anymore. John's gaze softened just slightly. He sighed, a sound heavy with years of pain. Son. Forgiveness isn't about one speech or one apology. It's about proving every day that you've changed, and that takes time, a lot of time. Ethan lowered his head. Then let me try, even if it takes the rest of my life. For the first time in what felt like forever, John allowed the corner of his mouth to lift, just a fraction, but enough to be noticed. And in that dimly lit room, father and son sat together, not reconciled, not healed. But no longer strangers. It wasn't an ending. It wasn't a beginning. It was something in between, a fragile bridge suspended over years of pain. Whether it would hold or collapse, no one could say. But for that night, the door was open, and sometimes that's enough. The days that followed were quieter. The headlines began to fade, as they always do. The world moved on to its next scandal, its next sensation. But inside a modest apartment on the edge of the city, 2 men, one graying and worn, the other young and bruised by his own choices, sat across from each other, learning how to breathe the same air again. John didn't forgive everything overnight. Forgiveness, he knew, wasn't a single act. It was a process, like tending to a wound. Sometimes it healed, sometimes it left a scar. And Ethan, for the first time in his life, accepted that truth. He no longer demanded absolution. He simply showed up again and again, not as a star, not as a headline, but as a son. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic reconciliations, just small moments, sharing a quiet dinner of reheated leftovers, watching a game on an old television without needing to say a word. Walking side by side down the same streets they once crossed years ago. And perhaps that is where the story leaves us, not with a perfect ending, but with an open one. Because life, in its truest form, rarely ties itself into neat conclusions. What do we take from this? That sacrifice often goes unseen, but it is never wasted. That respect is not bought by success, but earned by love and humility. And that sometimes the bravest thing a father or a son can do is simply to keep the door open. So maybe one day, when Ethan introduces his father not as a burden, but as the man who carried him on his shoulders, we'll know the bridge held. Until then, the light in that small apartment window flickers with something fragile, yet enduring, hope. Thank you, dear viewers, for staying with this story until the very end. May it remind you to cherish the people who sacrificed silently for you. And may it stir you to reach out while there's still time. From the bottom of my heart, I wish you and your family health, peace, and happiness. And if this story touched you, consider subscribing to our channel, so together we can keep sharing stories that remind us of what truly matters: love, forgiveness, and family.